The fog rolled in thick and heavy, as it so often did in the narrow, winding streets of Victorian London. The city, with its labyrinth of alleys and courtyards, seemed to hold its breath as the night crept in, shrouding its secrets in shadow. Gas lamps flickered like distant stars, casting a pale, trembling light that did little to banish the darkness. In this murky gloom, tales of terror and superstition thrived, none more so than the story of Spring-Heeled Jack, a name that would soon become synonymous with fear. It began, as such horrors often do, with whispers. In the winter of 1837, reports began to circulate of a strange figure haunting the outskirts of London. He was described as a man, or something like a man, dressed in outlandish, almost diabolical attire. Witnesses spoke of a long, flowing cloak, tight-fitting clothes that glistened in the lamplight, and a pair of piercing, glowing eyes that seemed to burn with an unholy fire. But it was his otherworldly agility that struck terror into the hearts of those who saw him. He could leap great distances, scaling walls and rooftops with the ease of a phantom, earning him the name Spring-Heeled Jack. At first, these stories were dismissed as the ramblings of drunkards and the idle gossip of superstitious servants. But as the sightings grew more frequent and the accounts more consistent, the authorities were forced to take notice. The first official report came from a young woman named Mary Stevens, a maid who lived in a small, humble house on Lavender Hill. It was late one night when Mary, returning from visiting her parents, found herself walking alone through Clapham Common, the fog curling around her like a living thing. The night was eerily quiet, save for the soft crunch of her footsteps on the frosty ground. But as she neared home, she became aware of another sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping, like the heartbeat of some unseen beast. Before she could react, a figure sprang from the shadows, landing in front of her with impossible grace. Mary gasped, stumbling back as the man or creature stood before her. His appearance was grotesque. A devilish grin stretched across his face, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. His eyes burned with a wild, malevolent light, and his hands, oh, those hands ended in long, claw-like fingers that reached out for her. He wore a tight, oilskin suit that clung to his body, and a large helmet that obscured much of his face, save for those terrible eyes and that ghastly grin. Before Mary could scream, the figure lunged at her, his claws raking across her dress, tearing the fabric as if it were paper. She felt the cold steel of his talons against her skin, and in that moment she knew she was in the grip of something not human. But then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he released her, leaping into the air with a force that sent him soaring over the rooftops, disappearing into the night. Mary's screams finally broke free, echoing through the empty streets as she ran for her life, her mind reeling from the encounter. By the time she reached the safety of her home, she was incoherent with terror, her story tumbling out in fragmented, desperate sentences. Her employer, shaken but skeptical, called for the police, who arrived to find Mary trembling, her dress torn, and her face pale as death. The constables took her statement, noting the details with grim faces, but they could offer little comfort. Whoever, or whatever, had attacked her was gone, vanished into the night without a trace. The incident might have been dismissed as a singular, disturbing event, but within days, another attack occurred, this time in the bustling district of Hammersmith. A young woman named Jane Alsop was the victim, and her experience was even more harrowing. It was late in the evening, when there was a frantic knock at the door of the Alsop family home. Jane, who was sitting by the fire with her sisters, rose to answer it. Through the frosted glass, she could see the silhouette of a man, his figure tall and imposing. When she opened the door, she was met by a stranger who claimed to be a police officer. He spoke urgently, saying he had caught Spring-Heeled Jack and needed a light to secure the criminal. His voice, though firm, held an unsettling undertone, a strange pitch that made Jane hesitate. Nevertheless, she hurried back inside, fetching a candle from the mantel. But as she returned to the door, the man revealed his true nature. In an instant, the stranger threw off his cloak, and Jane found herself face to face with a nightmare. The man was dressed in the same bizarre tight-fitting outfit that Mary Stevens had described, his eyes blazing like hot coals. Without warning, he spat a blue flame from his mouth, the eerie fire casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Jane screamed, dropping the candle as she tried to back away, but Spring-Heeled Jack was upon her. He grasped her with those iron-like claws, tearing at her clothing, his breath hot and foul against her skin. She struggled with all her might, her cries piercing the night, but he was impossibly strong. Just as she feared she would be dragged off into the darkness, her father and sisters rushed to her aid, drawn by her screams. Spring-Heeled Jack released her, leaping high into the air, clearing the garden wall with ease, and disappearing once again into the London fog. The Alsops, frantic with fear, reported the attack immediately. Jane's story spread quickly, fueling the growing hysteria in the city. The newspapers seized upon the tale, and soon, all of London was abuzz with talk of the mysterious Spring-Heeled Jack. Panic began to take hold, and for good reason. This was no ordinary criminal. This was a monster, a demon that seemed to defy all natural laws. The sightings multiplied in the weeks that followed, each more terrifying than the last. Spring-Heeled Jack appeared in various parts of London, always under the cover of night, always targeting the unsuspecting. He seemed to revel in the fear he provoked, his assaults growing bolder, more violent. Some claimed to have seen him bounding across rooftops. Others reported hearing his eerie laughter echoing through the fog, a sound that sent chills down the spines of even the bravest men. The authorities were at a loss. They increased patrols, posted watchmen on every corner, but Spring-Heeled Jack was elusive, slipping through their nets like smoke. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Cowan, was eventually forced to address the public hysteria. At a public meeting in early 1838, he read aloud an anonymous letter that had been sent to his office, warning of a nobleman's prank gone horribly wrong. According to the letter, the attacks were part of a wager among aristocrats, a game to see who could terrify the most people. But even this explanation failed to account for the supernatural abilities attributed to Spring-Heeled Jack. As the public fear reached a fever pitch, more bizarre reports began to emerge. Some claimed that Jack could breathe fire, others that he had horns and wings. He was described as a demon, a phantom, an emissary from hell itself. The line between reality and legend blurred, and the truth of who, or what, Spring-Heeled Jack was became more elusive with each passing day. Despite the efforts of the police and the growing vigilance of the public, Spring-Heeled Jack continued to elude capture. He seemed to vanish as quickly as he had appeared, leaving only fear and confusion in his wake. Some said he had fled the city, while others believed he had been caught and quietly dealt with by the authorities, who wished to avoid further panic. But no one could say for certain. The legend of Spring-Heeled Jack persisted, long after the attacks ceased. He became a figure of folklore, a cautionary tale told to children, a bogeyman that haunted the nightmares of Londoners for generations. Some claim to have seen him in other parts of England, in villages and towns far from the capital, his appearance unchanged, his leaps as powerful as ever. Others whispered that he was not of this world, that he would return when the time was right to spread terror once again. But for those who lived through those dark days in London, Spring-Heeled Jack was no mere story. He was a living, breathing nightmare, a terror that walked the streets in the dead of night, defying the laws of nature and leaving only fear in his wake. And though the city eventually moved on, forgetting the horrors of that winter, there were those who never forgot, who could still hear the faint, echoing laughter in the fog, who could still feel the icy grip of fear as they walked the lonely streets at night. For in the shadows of London, in the places where the light of the gas lamps could not reach, the memory of Spring-Heeled Jack lingered. A reminder that some horrors are not meant to be understood, and that the darkness of the human soul can take many forms, some of them all too real.